The desert sun hangs like molten brass in the cloudless sky above Serpent's Gap, casting harsh shadows across weathered buildings. A creaky sign, reading "Last Chance Saloon," swings in the hot breeze, its rusty chains providing the only music. On this dusty afternoon, through the thick heat waves rising from the ground, an elderly figure shuffles along, pushing a rickety wheelbarrow filled with prospecting tools. The man's weather-beaten face is partially hidden beneath a ragged hat that's seen better days. His clothes are patched and dusty, marking him as one of the countless prospectors who still cling to dreams of striking it rich in these played-out hills. A few young cowboys lounging outside the saloon nudge each other, smirking at the old-timers' determined but slow progress. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Last Chance Saloon is barely cooler than the scorching street. Outside, but at least the shade offers some relief. Old Jake Mason, known to most as Digger, makes his way to the bar, coins jingling softly in his threadbare pocket. The bartender, a burly man named Tom Whitaker, eyes the old prospector with a mixture of pity and mild annoyance. "Water!" Jake rasps, placing a single coin on the scratched wooden surface. His voice is rough from years of desert dust and minimal conversation. At a nearby table, three men in relatively new cowboy gear play cards. Their clothes are too clean, their guns too shiny, the mark of newcomers trying too hard to look the part. The leader of the group, a muscular man with a carefully groomed mustache who calls himself Blackjack Turner, throws down his cards in disgust. "Another round," he barks at the bartender, then turns his attention to Jake. "Hey, old-timer. Found any gold in the hills yet?" His companions snicker on cue. Jake quietly sips his water, seemingly lost in thought. His gnarled hands, marked with decades of scars and calluses, wrap around the glass like tree roots, seeking purchase in rocky soil. "I asked you a question." "Old man," Blackjack persists, standing up. He's the type who mistakes silence for weakness, age for vulnerability. Ain't polite to ignore folks like that. The saloon grows quiet, the kind of silence that precedes either violence or humiliation. Tom the bartender slowly moves his hand toward the shotgun hidden beneath the bar. "Nope," Jake finally responds, his voice barely above a whisper. "No gold today." Blackjack grins, showing teeth that are too white for a real cowboy. "No gold any day, I reckon. How long have you been out there? 5 years? 10? 15, Jake answers, still not turning around. 15 years! Blackjack roars with laughter, encouraging his companions to join in. 15 years of nothing but fool's errands and empty dreams. "Boys, I reckon we're looking at the biggest failure in all of Arizona territory." The laughter grows louder, drawing more patrons into the spectacle. Jake continues drinking his water, each sip measured and deliberate. "You know what your problem is, old-timer." Blackjack swaggers closer, his spurs jingling with each step. "You're living in the past. Gold rush is over. These hills are dead. Only fools and madmen think there's anything left worth finding." Jake finally turns, his movement slow and careful. His eyes, previously hidden beneath his hat brim, lock onto Blackjack's face. They're pale blue, almost colorless, like sun-bleached stone. Something in that gaze makes Blackjack's smile falter for just a moment. "Maybe," Jake says softly. "I ain't looking for gold." The words hang in the air like smoke, but Blackjack recovers his bravado quickly. "No? What else is worth hunting? In these godforsaken hills, our peace," Jake responds, turning back to his water. "Been hunting peace for 15 years. This draws the biggest laugh yet from Blackjack and his crew. They're so caught up in their mirth that they almost miss Jake's next words, spoken so quietly they might have been meant for no one at all. "Found more peace than I did in 30 years of hunting men." Blackjack's laughter cuts off abruptly. The saloon grows still again, but this time the silence has a different quality to it. Even the flies buzzing around the lamp seem to pause. What was that? Blackjack's hand drifts closer to his gun. Jake sighs, a sound heavy with resignation. He reaches into his jacket, making everyone tense, but pulls out only a worn leather wallet. From it, he extracts a yellowed newspaper clipping and places it carefully on the bar. The headline, faded but still legible, reads, "Notorious Mason the Hunter brings in Carlson gang single-handed." Below it is a photograph of a younger man with pale eyes and a hard expression, standing over 3 bound outlaws. The resemblance to Jake is unmistakable, though the man in the photograph stands straight and proud, his eyes holding none of the weariness that now marks the old prospector's gaze. "That was a lifetime ago," Jake says quietly, already regretting the revelation. Different man. Different time. Blackjack stares at the clipping, his face cycling through several emotions. Disbelief, recognition, and finally, a calculating interest that's more dangerous than his previous mockery. "Well, well," he drawls, though his voice has lost some of its swagger. "The famous Mason the Hunter, reduced to digging in the dirt for scraps. How the mighty have fallen." Jake carefully folds the clipping and returns it to his wallet. Mighty. Don't enter into it, son. Just a tired old man trying to forget things best left in the past. "Funny thing about the past," Blackjack says, his hand now resting openly on his gun. "It has a way of catching up to a man. Boys, you know who Mason the Hunter was? He was the terror of every outlaw from here to Texas. They say he brought in more bounties dead than alive. They say he could track a man across bare rock and shoot the wings off a fly." The other patrons are now edging away from the confrontation, finding sudden interest in distant corners of the saloon. Tom, the bartender's hand hasn't moved from beneath the bar. "They say a lot of things," Jake responds wearily. "Most ain't worth the breath used to speak to them. They also say," Blackjack continues, his voice taking on a harder edge, "that the last gang he hunted made off with over 50,000 in army payroll. Never found a trace of them, or the money." Jake's shoulders tense almost imperceptibly. "Like I said, that was a different time. Maybe," Blackjack's grin returns, but now it's predatory. "Or maybe you didn't catch them at all. Maybe you made a deal. Maybe that's why you've been out in these hills all these years, playing Prospector, waiting for things to quiet down before you dig up something that ain't gold." Jake stands slowly, his joints protesting the movement. "Think I'll be going now?" "Oh, I don't think so, old-timer," Blackjack says, and now his gun is in his hand. "I think you and I need to have a longer conversation about buried treasure." The old prospector looks at the gun, then at Blackjack's face, his pale eyes suddenly sharp and clear as desert sky. When he speaks, his voice has changed, losing its quaver, becoming something hard and cold as steel. "Son," he says quietly, "you really don't want to do this." The tension in the room stretches like a bowstring pulled too tight. Blackjack's fingers twitch on his gun, but something in the old man's stance makes him hesitate. It's subtle. The way Jake's weight has shifted ever so slightly forward, the almost imperceptible change in his breathing. "You know what else they used to say about Mason the Hunter?" Blackjack's voice carries a slight tremor now, though he's trying to hide it. "They said he never drew first, said he always gave a man a chance to walk away." "That's right." Jake replies, his voice still quiet, but carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent saloon. "Always did. Still do." One of Blackjack's companions, a weaselly-looking man with a patchy beard, nervously fingers his gun belt. "Jack, maybe we ought to—" "Shut up!" Blackjack snaps, his composure cracking. "He's just a broken-down old man, probably can't even—" The movement is so fast it seems impossible for aged joints and weathered muscles. Jake's right hand drops to his side, and suddenly there's a Colt appearing as if by magic, materializing in his grip like it was always meant to be there. The metal doesn't gleam. It's blued steel, worn smooth by years of use and care, a working man's weapon, rather. Then a showpiece. Blackjack's gun is only halfway up when he realizes his mistake. His eyes widen as he stares down the unwavering barrel of Jake's revolver, understanding far too late that he's been playing cards with a mountain lion while thinking it was just an old house cat. Like I said, Jake's voice hasn't changed. Still quiet, still almost gentle. You don't want to do this. Walk away, son. Go find yourself another saloon, another town, another life. This one won't end well for you. For a long moment, the only sound is the creaking of floorboards as the other patrons try to make themselves even scarcer. Then Blackjack, slowly, carefully, begins to lower his gun. Smart choice, Jake says, but keeps his weapon trained steady. Now, a few things you ought to know before you go. First, everything you heard about Mason the Hunter, it's all true, every single word. Second, that army payroll case, solved it 15 years ago. Money's been returned, outlaws have been buried. And third, he pauses, making sure he has Blackjack's complete attention. If you ever make the mistake of trying to dig up my past again, you'll find out firsthand why they called me the Hunter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Blackjack swallows. Hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like a cork in water. He holsters his gun with exaggerated care, then backs toward the door, his companions already scrambling to follow. "We're leaving," he announces to no one in particular. "No trouble here." "One more thing," Jake calls after them, his gun still unwavering. "Might want to tell your friends waiting outside to ride on too. Don't think I didn't notice them watching my wheelbarrow earlier." Blackjack's face shows a flicker of surprise before he can hide it. He nods once, sharply, then vanishes through the swinging doors, his boots pounding a rapid retreat on the wooden sidewalk outside. Only when the sound of galloping horses fades into the distance does Jake finally lower his gun. His hands are steady as he holsters the weapon, but as soon as it's secured, a slight tremor returns to his fingers. He turns back to the bar, where his water still sits, now warm and dusty. Tom, the bartender, slowly removes his hand from beneath the counter, letting out a long breath. "That was something else, Mr. Mason. Something else entirely." Jake picks up his glass, staring into the water as if searching for answers. "Wasn't supposed to be anything at all. 15 years, Tom. 15 years of quiet, and now—" He shakes his head. "Reckon I'll be having visitors soon. Word travels fast in these parts. You gonna be all right?" Tom asks, genuine concern in his voice. Jake's weathered face creases in what might be a smile, though it doesn't reach his pale eyes. "Always am, but I think—" He pauses, considering his next words carefully. "I think maybe it's time I paid a visit to some old friends. Been avoiding them long enough." He drains his water, places the glass carefully on the bar, and turns toward the door. The other patrons scramble to clear a path, watching with a mixture of fear and awe as the old prospector makes his way outside. The afternoon sun catches his face as he steps through the doorway, and for just a moment the years seem to fall away, revealing the steel beneath the weathered exterior. The legend of Mason the Hunter, it seems, isn't quite finished yet. The setting sun paints Serpent's Gap in shades of blood and gold as Jake Mason makes his way to the small shack he calls home. It's a humble dwelling on the outskirts of town, but its position gives him a clear view of anyone approaching from any direction. Old habits die hard. Inside, Jake lights a lamp and moves to a corner of the room. He kneels down slowly, his joints protesting, and pries up a loose floorboard. From the space beneath, he removes a wooden box that hasn't seen daylight in 15 years. The brass hinges creak as he opens it, revealing contents that tell the story of another life. Newspaper clippings, wanted posters, and beneath them all, a marshal's badge, its silver surface tarnished with age. Never thought I'd be looking at these again, he mutters to himself, spreading the items across his worn table. Each piece of paper represents a captured outlaw, a life ended or changed forever by his actions. The names read like a roll call. Of the West's most notorious, Red McCall, the Dawson brothers, Snake Eyes Thompson, all brought to justice by Mason the Hunter. His fingers pause over the last wanted poster in the stack. The paper is yellowed, its edges frayed, but the face staring back at him is still clear. James Coyote Hawkins, leader of the Hawkins gang. The same gang that stole that army payroll 15 years ago. The same gang that... A floorboard creaks behind him. Jake's hand moves toward his gun, but a familiar voice stops him. You really are getting old, Jake. Time was, nobody could sneak up on you like that. He turns slowly to face the intruder. Sarah. Hawkins stands in his doorway, her dark hair now streaked with grey, but her eyes still sharp as ever. She holds a Winchester rifle with casual expertise, though it's not quite pointed at him. Not yet. Sarah, Jake acknowledges quietly. Didn't expect to see you again. Funny how things work out. She steps into the lamplight, her movement graceful despite the years. Word travels fast. Heard there was some excitement in town today. Just a misunderstanding with some young bulls, Jake says, watching her carefully. Nothing worth riding 20 miles for. Sarah's laugh is harsh. Nothing worth riding 20 miles for? The great Mason the Hunter showing his face again after 15 years of playing Prospector? That's worth riding 100 miles for? Her eyes fell to the papers spread across his table. I see you're taking a trip down memory lane. Past has a way of catching up, Jake admits. Your brother's poster was the last one I ever carried. Sarah's grip tightens on the Winchester, and now you're carrying it again. No. Jake shakes his head slowly. That chapter's closed, Sarah. Has been for 15 years. Is it? She moved closer, the rifle now definitely pointed his way. Because I heard those young bulls in town were asking about the army payroll. The one Jimmy was accused of stealing, the one that was never found. Jake's pale eyes meet hers steadily. You know as well as I do that money's long gone. Army got it back, the case was closed. That's the official story, Sarah agrees. The one you told, the one that let you retire quietly to these hills. But Jimmy, her voice catches slightly, Jimmy never told me where it really went, even at the end. Sarah. Jake's voice carries a warning note. 15 years, Jake. 15 years I've wondered if you really caught him fair, or if something else happened that day. 15 years watching you dig holes in these hills, supposedly looking for gold. The rifle barrel rises slightly. Maybe you weren't looking for gold at all. Maybe you were looking for something else. Something you and Jimmy buried before. I brought him in, Jake finishes quietly. Is that what you think happened? I don't know what happened. Sarah's voice turns bitter. All I know is my brother died in prison, swearing he never touched that army payroll. And the famous Mason the Hunter suddenly quit the badge and turned prospector, spending 15 years searching these same hills where Jimmy's gang was last seen. Jake is silent for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable in the lamplight. Finally, he says, You've got it all wrong, Sarah. Always did. Then tell me the truth, she demands. You owe me that much. Truth. Jake's laugh is as harsh as hers was. Truth is, your brother was better than most of the men I hunted. He had a code, wouldn't kill unless he had to, treated his men fair, even treated his prisoners decently. He pauses, his eyes distant. That's why I gave him a chance to surrender. But he didn't, Sarah says softly. No, Jake agrees, he didn't. Said he'd rather die than rot in prison for something he didn't do. His hand moves slowly to his shirt pocket, drawing out a folded piece of paper. Wrote this the night before. They hanged him, asked me to deliver it to you. I never did. Sarah's rifle wavers slightly. A letter, all these years. Couldn't face you, Jake admits. Not after everything. Figured you'd shoot me on sight. I still might. But the threat sounds hollow now. What does it say? Never read it, Jake says, holding out the yellowed paper. Wasn't meant for me. Sarah hesitates, then slowly lowers the Winchester. She takes the letter with trembling fingers, unfolding it carefully. As she reads, her face goes through a cascade of emotions. Anger, grief, surprise, and finally, something like understanding. "Oh, Jimmy," she whispers, "you fool." "Want to tell me what it says?" Jake asks quietly. Sarah looks up from the letter, tears in her eyes. He says you were right. Says the money was never stolen at all. It was all a setup, wasn't it? The army payroll, the chase, all of it. Jake nods slowly. Your brother was helping us, working with the army to catch some corrupt officials who were using gangs like his to cover their tracks. The payroll theft was staged to flush them out. But something went wrong. Someone talked. Jimmy took the fall to protect his inside man. And you? Sarah's voice is barely a whisper. Where were you when they hanged him? Watching from the crowd, Jake's voice is heavy with old pain. Had to make it look good. Had to keep looking for that non-existent money so the real thieves would feel safe. 15 years of digging holes, waiting for them to make a mistake. His pale eyes glitter in the lamplight. And today, they finally did. Sarah lowers herself into a chair, the Winchester forgotten in her lap. Blackjack and his boys, she says slowly. They're not just random troublemakers, are they? No. Jake moves to his window, checking the darkness outside. They work for Judge Monroe, the same Judge Monroe who presided over Jimmy's trial, the same man who's been quietly buying up failed mines and worthless claims all across the territory. But why now? After all these years? Jake returns to the table, gathering up the old wanted posters. Because Monroe's planning something big. Those worthless claims he's been buying, they're about to become very valuable. Railroads coming through, and wouldn't you know it, the planned route runs right through Monroe's properties. Inside, information, Sarah breathes, just like before. Exactly like before. Jake's voice hardens. But this time, he's getting nervous. Heard rumors about an old lawman who might know too much. Sent his boys to check if the stories about Mason the hunter were true, and you gave them quite a show. A ghost of a smile touches Sarah's lips. Just like you planned? Jake shrugs. Needed to flush them out somehow, make them think I'm sitting on information about that old army payroll, make them nervous enough to report back to Monroe. You're setting a trap, Sarah realizes. Using yourself as bait. Been setting it for 15 years. Jake pulls out his gun, checking it with practiced care. Every hole I dug, every claim I worked, all to convince Monroe I was searching for something. Now he thinks I'm close to finding proof of his schemes. And are you? Jake's weathered face creases in a grim smile. Better. I found his partner. The man who gave Jimmy the information about the corrupt officials. The man who was supposed to testify but disappeared instead. Sarah leans forward. He's alive? Alive and ready to talk. Been hiding him for the past month in an abandoned mine shaft up in Thunder Canyon. Man's got documents, bank records, everything we need to prove Monroe's been running the same scheme for 20 years. Jake holsters his gun. But Monroe's boys will be back, and in greater numbers. They'll try to find him before he can testify. So what's your plan? First light, I'm heading to Thunder Canyon. Need to get him to the territorial marshal in Santa Fe. Jake pauses, studying Sarah's face. Could use some help. Someone who knows these hills as well as I do. Someone with reason to want justice. Done. Sarah picks up the Winchester, running her hands along its worn stock. Jimmy always said I was a better shot than him. That you were, Jake agrees. But this won't be easy. Monroe's got men watching all the main trails, and once they realize what we're doing, they'll come with everything they have. Sarah finishes. She stands, squaring her shoulders. Good. Been waiting 15 years to set things right. Jake nods slowly. There's something else you should know. That young fellow in town today, Blackjack, he's Monroe's nephew. Boy doesn't know it, but he's been doing his uncle's dirty work for years, just like those corrupt officials used Jimmy's gang. History repeats itself, Sarah says bitterly. Maybe. Jake moves to his door, checking the latch. Or maybe this time we can break the cycle. But first, we need to get through tonight. Monroe's men will have seen you ride in. They'll be watching this shack, waiting to see what we do. As if to confirm his words, a horse whinnies somewhere in the darkness outside. Both Jake and Sarah melt away from the windows. Weapons ready. How many? Sarah whispers. Jake closes his eyes, listening intently. 4, maybe 5 riders, moving quietly, trying to surround us. He opens his eyes, and for a moment Sarah sees the legendary bounty hunter that struck fear into outlaws across the territory. They'll wait till full, in dark, then make their move. Like old times, Sarah says, checking her rifle's load. You always did your best work at night. Had to, Jake replies grimly. Evil things prefer the dark. He moves to the lamp, his hand hovering over the flame. You ready? Sarah takes up position by the back window, her rifle steady. Jimmy would have enjoyed this. Yes, Jake agrees, softly. Yes, he would. His hand drops to the lamp. Remember, they'll want to take us alive. Need to know what we know. Their mistake, Sarah says, and in her voice is an echo of 15 years of grief and rage. The lamp goes out, plunging, the shack into darkness. Outside, the moon slides behind a cloud, as if nature herself is preparing for what's to come. For a long moment there is only silence. Then, somewhere in the night, a twig snaps, and Mason the hunter goes to work one last time. The first shot comes from the north, a muzzle flash briefly illuminating the scrub brush where Monroe's men hide. The bullet thunks harmlessly into the shack's thick wooden walls. Jake doesn't return fire, not yet. He's counting flashes, marking positions, building a map in his mind like he's done countless times before. 3 by the creek bed, he whispers to Sarah, who's crouched beneath the back window. 2 more working their way around to the east. They're trying to push us toward the cliffside. Sarah's laugh is soft and deadly. Amateurs. Anyone who knew you back then would know better than to try flanking the hunter at night. A voice calls out from the darkness. Mason, we just want to talk. Come on out, nice and peaceful. That'll be Ray Holbrook, Jake mutters. Monroe's headgun hand. Used to ride with the Carlson gang before I brought them in. He raises his voice. Kind of late for a social call, Ray. Times like these, business don't keep regular hours, Holbrook shouts back. Judge Monroe's mighty interest in having a word with you. Bet he is, Sarah whispers. Her finger caresses the Winchester's trigger. Want me to show him how interested I am? Jake shakes his head. Not yet. Let them bunch up a bit more. He moves to another window, his steps silent despite the creaky floorboards. They're expecting an old man's reflexes. Let's see how that works out for them. More muzzle flashes, this time from multiple directions. They're probing, trying to draw return fire to locate their targets within the shack. Jake and Sarah remain still, watching, waiting. The moon peeks out briefly from behind its cloud, casting silver shadows across the yard. Remember that job in Dead Horse Canyon? Sarah asks suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. When Jimmy's gang had those army deserters pinned down. I remember, Jake replies softly. Your brother kept them busy up front while you and I worked our way around behind. Used the moonlight just like this. 15 men. Sarah's voice carries a note of pride. Never knew what hit them. A bottle smashes against the front of the shack, the sharp smell of kerosene filling the air. Last chance, Mason, Holbrook calls out. Next one's lit. Jake's pale, eyes narrow in the darkness. They're getting impatient. Good. He touches Sarah's shoulder. You still throw like you used to? She pats the pocket of her coat, where something heavy clinks. Better. When I give the word, Jake instructs, toss one through each window. Then get down and cover the back door. They'll think we're making a run for it. Sarah nods, understanding. It's like the years between them melt away, and they're back working. Together, Hunter and Scout closing in on another gang of outlaws. Only this time they're the ones being hunted. The moon disappears again, plunging the scene into perfect darkness. A whispered count passes between them. 1, 2. On 3, Sarah's arm moves in a fluid arc. Glass shatters as something small, and heavy flies through each of the shack's front windows. Confused shouts come from outside, followed by 2 sharp explosions that light up the night. The blasts aren't deadly, but the magnesium flares inside the glass containers turn night into day for crucial seconds, ruining the attacker's night vision. Jake moves like a man half his age, his gun seeming to fire before it even clears the holster. 2 shots, 2 cries of pain from the creek bed. Sarah's Winchester roars, the sound echoing off the cliff face, adding to the confusion. "They're running!" a voice shouts. "Cut them off at the back!" Boot steps thunder around the shack's perimeter. Jake slides to the back door, pressing himself. Against the wall, the door bursts open, and 2 shapes charge through. The first runs straight into Jake's fist, enhanced by the weight of his gun barrel. The second manages to fire wildly before Sarah's rifle stock cracks against his skull. 3. Down, Jake counts calmly, dragging the unconscious men clear of the door. 2 to go. "Mason!" Holbrook's voice carries an edge of panic now. "You're just making things worse for yourself." "Actually, Ray," Jake calls back, "I'd say things are looking up." He nods to Sarah, who vanishes through the back door like a shadow. "You think this is the end of it?" Holbrook shouts. "Monroe's got friends in every territory. There's nowhere you can hide." "Who's hiding?" Jake responds. He moves to the front window, deliberately letting his silhouette show. "I spent 15 years waiting for this night, planning for it. You really think I'm the one who needs to worry about hiding?" A shot kicks up splinters near his head. Jake doesn't flinch. "Your hands are shaking, Ray." "They didn't shake. Course that was before prison, wasn't it? Before you turned state's evidence against the Carlsons to save your own neck." "Shut up!" Another shot, wild and desperate. "Tell me something," Jake continues, his voice carrying clearly through the night. "Does Monroe know about that? About how quick you were to turn on your last employer? Man like that, he probably wouldn't sleep too well, knowing he's trusted his life to someone with your flexible loyalties." The darkness is silent for a long moment. Then, "You're trying to get in my head, old man. Won't work. Ain't the same scared kid you hauled in 15 years ago?" "No," Jake agrees. "You're not. That kid had principles, twisted as they were. That kid wouldn't work for a man like Monroe, wouldn't help frame innocent men or murder witnesses." More silence. Jake can almost hear the wheels turning in Holbrook's mind. "How much is he paying you, Ray? Enough to bet your life on? Because that's what you're doing. Right now, Sarah Hawkins is working her way around behind you. You remember Sarah, don't you? Jimmy's sister, the one who could shoot the wings off a fly at 100 yards. A twig snaps in the darkness. Holbrook spins, firing blindly. "Just missed." Sarah's voice comes from somewhere to his left. "Want to try again?" "It's over, Ray," Jake calls out. "Your boys are down. Monroe's scheme is about to unravel, but you could still walk away from this, could even set some things right. You're crazy." Holbrook's voice shakes. "Monroe would hunt me down. Like I hunted you down," Jake asks quietly. "Difference is, Ray, I gave you a chance to surrender. Monroe won't be that generous. Man like that, he ties up loose ends permanently like." The night holds its breath. Then slowly a pistol drops into the dust. "Smart choice," Jake says. "Sarah, got him covered," she responds. "He's not going anywhere." Jake steps out onto his front porch, his gun trained steadily on Holbrook's shadowy figure. "Now then, Ray, it seems to me you've got some decisions to make. Could try to ride back to Monroe, tell him how you failed. Could take your chances with his mercy." He pauses. Or you could ride with us to Santa Fe, tell the territorial marshal what you know about the judge's operations. Your choice. Holbrook's laugh is hollow. Some choice, prison or a shallow grave. There's always choices, Jake says. 15 years ago, I chose to let a guilty man swing to protect the innocent. Your boss chose to sacrifice good men to cover his crimes. Jimmy Hawkins chose to die rather than betray his principles. His voice hardens. Time to decide what kind of man you want to be, Ray. Time's running out for all of us. The moon emerges once more, revealing Holbrook's face. He looks older than Jake remembered, worn down by years of serving men like Monroe. Finally he speaks. Monroe's got men watching every trail to Santa Fe. Even if I help you, we'll never make it. Jake's weathered face creases in a smile. That's funny. They used to say the same thing about bringing in the Carlson gang. He steps forward, offering Holbrook his hand. Sometimes, Ray, the impossible jobs are the only ones worth taking. As Holbrook grasps his hand, the first light of dawn begins to paint the eastern sky. Sarah emerges from the shadows, her Winchester still ready but no longer aimed to kill. The night's violence is ending, but they all know it's only the beginning. The real hunt is about to begin. Inside the shack, Jake tends to their unconscious. Prisoners, while Sarah keeps watch, and Holbrook sits uneasily by the cold stove. Dawn's first light seeps through the bullet holes in the walls, creating dusty beams in the air. They'll need to be secured before we leave, Jake says, checking the pulse of one of the fallen men. Can't risk them running back to Monroe. Sarah tosses him some rope. Already ahead of you. Found these in your storage chest. Along with some other interesting items. She eyes the chest in the corner. You've been planning this for a while, haven't you? 15 years, Jake confirms, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he binds the unconscious men. Every supply, every piece of equipment, all carefully chosen. Even this shack. He pats one of the thick walls. Built it myself, extra reinforced. Knew someday it would have to withstand more than just the weather. Holbrook shifts uncomfortably. Monroe's got at least 30 men on his payroll. Once he realizes we've turned, he'll send every one of them after us. Counting on it, Jake says, checking the knots one final time. While they're chasing us, they won't be watching his other operations. Makes things easier for certain territorial marshals who've been building a case against him. Sarah's eyes narrow. You're working with the law after all this time. Never stopped, Jake admits. Just went about it differently. Sometimes you have to step back to see the whole picture. He moves to his chest, pulling out more supplies. Ammunition, dried food, medical supplies. Monroe's just one piece of a bigger puzzle. His friends in high places, the ones who helped him frame Jimmy, they're the real target. A conspiracy, Holbrook breathes. That's why you needed someone on the inside, someone who could verify Monroe's connections. Your testimony helps, Jake nods. But the real proof is with our friend in Thunder Canyon, man named Peterson, used to be Monroe's personal secretary before he grew a conscience. Marcus Peterson. Holbrook's face pales. Monroe said he died in a hunting accident 3 years ago. That's what Monroe wanted everyone to believe. Jake checks his gun, then begins loading extra cartridges into his belt. Truth is, Peterson's been gathering evidence, names, dates, bank transfers, everything needed to bring down not just Monroe, but half the corrupt officials in the territory. Sarah's Winchester comes up, and you trust him? After what happened with Jimmy, trust but verify, Jake says grimly. Been watching Peterson for months, before I moved him to Thunder Canyon. His story checks out. More importantly, he's got documents, real ones, with signatures and seals that can't be faked. Which is why we need to get him to Santa Fe, Holbrook realizes, before Monroe's men find him. Or before his friends in high places decide to tie up loose ends, Jake agrees. He turns to Sarah. That's why I need you. You know these hills better than anyone, every hidden trail, every secret pass. And you trust me? Sarah's voice is neutral. After 15 years of believing I might put a bullet in your back, Jake meets her eyes. Your brother was a good man who died protecting what he believed in. You've got the same steel in your spine. Besides, his voice softens slightly, you could have shot me 100 times tonight. Didn't. A ghost of a smile touches Sarah's lips. Night's not over yet. Speaking of which, Holbrook interrupts, what are we going to do with them? He nods toward the bound men who are starting to stir. Jake pulls out an old pocket watch, checking the time. Stage comes through in about 2 hours. Driver's an old friend. He'll make sure they get to the territorial jail in Yuma. By the time Monroe gets them out, we'll be long gone. And our horses? Sarah asks. They'll be looking for them. Already thought of that. Jake moves to the back door. Follow me. He leads them to what appears to be an abandoned mine shaft behind the shack. Inside, hidden from view, are 5 fresh horses, all ready, saddled and supplied. Been keeping them here for the past week, Jake explains. Different breeds than our usual mounts. Monroe's men will be looking for my old dun and your bay mare. Always 3 steps ahead, Sarah murmurs. Just like the old days. Had to be. Jake checks the horse's tack one final time. In this game, you're either the hunter or the hunted. No in between. Holbrook examines one of the horses, a sturdy black gelding. What's our route? First light, we rode to Thunder Canyon, Jake says, but not by any trail Monroe's men would expect. Sarah? She nods, understanding. The old Apache path through Dead Man's Gulch. It's treacherous, but it'll save us half a day's ride. More importantly, only a handful of people know it exists, and most of them are dead, Jake adds grimly. We'll need to move fast. Monroe's got men watching Thunder Canyon, but they're expecting us to come in from the east. We'll hit it from the north through the old copper mine tunnels. Those tunnels collapsed years ago, Holbrook objects. That's what everyone thinks. Sarah's smile is sharp. Jimmy's gang used them as a hideout more than once. The collapse was staged. Jake begins transferring supplies to the horses. We've got maybe an hour before Monroe realizes something's wrong. 2 hours before his men start searching the hills. If we're lucky, we can reach Thunder Canyon by nightfall. And if we're not lucky, Holbrook asks, then we remind them why they used to tell stories about Mason the Hunter. Jake's voice carries an edge of steel. And why Sarah Hawkins was the only scout who could track him. Outside, the sun begins to rise over Serpent's Gap, painting the sky in shades of fire. A new day is dawning, but for Jake Mason, it feels more like stepping back in time. The weight of his gun at his hip, the familiar tension in his muscles, the mental calculations of distance and timing. It's all coming back, like an old song he never truly forgot. Mount up, he orders softly. Time to hunt some devils. As they ride out into the growing light, Jake takes one last look at his shack, at the 15 years of peaceful deception it represents. Then he turns his horse north, toward Thunder Canyon, and whatever fate awaits them there. Behind them, the first rays of sun strike the bullet holes in the shack's walls, turning them into points of light like stars in the coming dawn. The nights. Battle is over, but the war is just beginning. And somewhere out there, Judge Monroe is about to learn that some legends never die. They just get better at waiting for the right moment to strike. They ride in silence for a time, following a trail so faint only Sarah seems able to see it. The plateau stretches out before them, a sea of sun-baked rock and scraggly vegetation. Jake's wound has stopped bleeding, but the bandana is stained dark with dried blood. We should stop and tend to that properly, Sarah says, eyeing his arm. Jake shakes his head. No time, besides it was worse. Like that time in Tombstone, Sarah's voice carries a hint of nostalgia. When Jimmy shot you, that was an accident, Jake responds, a rare smile touching his lips. He was aiming for someone else. Holbrook, riding between them, looks from one to the other. You two have a strange way of remembering the good old days. In our line of work, Sarah says, Any day you survived was a good day. She reins in suddenly, raising her hand for silence. Listen, they halt, the only sound being their horses' heavy breathing and the whisper of wind across the rocks. Then they hear it, the distant beat of hooves, coming from multiple directions. They're trying to box us in, Jake says, his eyes scanning the horizon. Apache riders to the south, probably more to the east, and if I know Monroe's men, they'll be coming up from the north. What about the burial grounds? Holbrook asks. The trail you mentioned? Jake points to a distant rise where ancient stone cairns stand like silent sentinels. Through there, but we can't just ride straight in, need to lose our pursuers first, or we'll lead them right to it. Sarah nods, understanding. Split up? Split up, Jake confirms, like we used to do with Jimmy's gang. Sarah, you take Holbrook west toward the old mission ruins. Make it look good, but don't engage unless you have to. I'll head east, try to draw the main force after me. That's suicide, Holbrook protests. You can't take on that many alone. Jake checks his gun with practiced care. Don't plan to fight. Them. Just need to keep them busy while you two circle back to the burial grounds. I'll meet you there at sunset. And if you don't show, Sarah asks, her voice carefully neutral, then you and Holbrook ride for Thunder Canyon without me. Peterson's testimony is what matters. Everything else is just details. Sarah studies him for a long moment, then reaches into her saddlebag. She pulls out a small leather pouch and tosses it to him. Jimmy's old signal flares might come in handy. Jake catches the pouch, weighing it thoughtfully. Still carrying these after all these years? Some habits die hard, she responds, like trusting you with my brother's life. She pauses, then adds softly, don't make me regret trusting you with mine. Jake tucks the pouch into his jacket. Never have before, not planning to start now. He turns to Holbrook. Remember what I said about choices, Ray? Well, here's another one. You ride with Sarah. You follow her lead exactly. She tells you to jump. You don't even ask how high. You understand? Holbrook nods, his face serious. I understand. And Mason, thanks for giving me a chance to set things right. Thank me if we survive, Jake responds. He checks the sun's position. 2 hours till sunset. If I'm not at the burial grounds by then, don't wait. He gathers his reins. Ready? Sarah's answer is to spur her horse westward, Holbrook following close behind. Jake watches them go, then turns his mount toward the east. The distant sound of pursuit is growing louder. All right, old friend, he pats his horse's neck. Let's show them why they used to tell stories about us. He rides at an angle to his real destination, making sure to leave clear tracks in the occasional patches of soft ground. Every so often, he lets himself be glimpsed by his pursuers, a distant figure on horseback, just visible enough to keep them interested, just far enough ahead to frustrate them. It's a game he knows well, one he played countless times as a bounty hunter. Only, now he's the one being hunted, and the stakes are higher than ever. His arm throbs where the bullet grazed him, but he pushes the pain aside, focusing on the terrain ahead. A rifle shot kicks up dust near his horse's hooves. They're getting closer. Good. The more of them following him, the fewer chasing Sarah. And Holbrook. He pulls out one of Jimmy's signal flares, studying it thoughtfully. The old gang used them to coordinate complex ambushes, the different colored smokes carrying coded messages across vast distances. More shots, closer now. Jake risks a glance back and counts at least 15 riders, a mix of Apache warriors and Monroe's men. Seems the judge's gold has bought him some unlikely allies. The pursuit is spread out, the faster riders pulling ahead of the main group. Perfect. Jake lights the first flare, leaving a trail of red smoke as he rides. To his pursuers, it might look like a desperate attempt to signal for help, but he's counting. On Sarah, remembering the old gang's codes. Red smoke moving east meant one thing: the trap is ready. He angles toward a particular rock formation, one he'd noted on their way into the canyon. From a distance, it looks like a solid wall of stone. But Jimmy's gang hadn't been the first outlaws to use these lands. Old Spanish bandits had found the hidden pass centuries ago, marking it with signs only those who knew where to look could read. The pursuers are closing fast now, probably expecting him to be trapped against the rock wall. Jake allows himself a grim smile as he lights the second flare, green smoke this time. Spring the trap! He rides straight at the rock wall at full gallop. Behind him, he hears shouts of triumph turn to confusion. At the last possible moment, he turns parallel to the wall, following a line of darker stone that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know it was there. His horse's hooves find the narrow path without hesitation. The hidden pass opens suddenly, a knife slash in the rock, barely wide enough for a single rider. Jake takes it at full speed, ducking low over his horse's neck as the walls close in around him. Behind him, he hears chaos as the pursuit tries to follow. Too many riders, too narrow a space. The pass twists and turns, following what must have once been a watercourse. Jake navigates it from memory, having studied Jimmy's old maps during his years of preparation. After several minutes of hard riding, he emerges onto a shelf overlooking his back trail. Below, he can see his pursuers in disarray. Several horses have fallen in the crush to enter the narrow pass. Others are milling about in confusion as their riders argue about which way he went. The Apache warriors are gesturing angrily at Monroe's men, clearly blaming them for losing. The trail, Jake allows himself a moment of satisfaction before turning his horse toward the burial grounds. The sun is getting low, painting the desert in shades of gold and purple. He's bought Sarah and Holbrook the time they needed, but the day isn't over yet. As if to confirm his thoughts, a distant gunshot echoes across the plateau. It's coming. From the direction of the old mission ruins. Sarah and Holbrook have found trouble of their own. Jake checks his gun, then looks at the setting sun. If he rides for the burial grounds now, he might make it by sunset. If he turns toward the gunfire, he'll definitely be late. Another shot rings out, followed by several more. "Sorry, Sarah," he mutters, turning his horse toward the sound of gunfire. "Guess some habits really do die hard. The hunt isn't over yet." In fact, as Jake rides toward the sound of battle with the sun setting behind him, he realizes it's only just beginning. And somewhere out there in Thunder Canyon, a man with secrets worth dying for is waiting, hoping that Mason the Hunter still lives up to his legend. Time to prove that legends never really die, they just get better at surviving. Jake rides hard into the gathering darkness, the blue smoke from his flare creating ethereal patterns in the twilight air. He can hear the confusion behind him, shouts in English, Spanish, and Apache, the thunder of hooves moving in different directions. The split trail gambit is working, at least for now, but Jake knows it won't last long. Soon enough, someone will figure out the trick. Probably Wade. The deputy marshal isn't known for his morals, but his intelligence is another matter, which means Jake needs to create a more convincing diversion. He reins in at a rocky outcrop, one that offers a good view of the surrounding terrain. The desert is transforming as night approaches, shadows lengthening into strange shapes that play tricks on the eye. Perfect conditions for what he has in mind. From his saddlebag, he pulls out something he hasn't used in 15 years, a small wooden box containing the tools of his former trade. Inside are various items that helped build his legend, specialty ammunition, a collapsible spyglass, and most importantly, a set of small mirrors designed to catch and reflect moonlight. "Time to give them something to chase," he mutters, setting up the first mirror. It's an old bounty hunter's trick, one he learned from a Mexican cazador early in his career. Properly placed, the mirrors can create the illusion of movement, of riders moving through the darkness. He positions 3 mirrors at carefully calculated angles, then lights another flare, red this time. In the growing darkness, with the Smoke and reflected light playing across the desert. It looks like multiple riders moving south at speed. A rifle shot cracks in the distance, followed by answering fire. Jake smiled grimly. The various groups are already starting to mistake each other for quarry in the darkness. Confusion and paranoia will do half his work for him. But there's more to his plan than just creating chaos. Wade's presence has complicated things, but it's also created an opportunity. The corrupt deputy marshal's reputation for violence is well known throughout the territory. If he's involved in the pursuit, other law enforcement agencies might hesitate to join in, fearing to get caught in whatever brutal business Wade is conducting. Jake checks his ammunition, then pulls out something else from his collection of tools. A deputy marshal's badge, tarnished with age, but still official. He'd taken it off a corrupt lawman years ago, keeping it as a reminder of why he does what he does. Now it might serve another purpose. He pins the badge to his vest, making sure it's visible. Then he lights his last flare, green this time, and rides toward a particular rock formation he'd noted earlier. If his memory of the territory is correct, there should be... yes, there it is. An old line shack, probably used by cattle rustlers in years past. It's barely standing, but it'll serve his purpose. Jake dismounts, leading his horse behind the shack. Then he begins his preparations. First, he arranges his mirrors to create the illusion of multiple horses moving near the shack. Next, he sets up several small charges, not enough to hurt anyone, but sufficient to create confusion and noise. Finally, he positions himself where he'll have a clear view of anyone approaching. He doesn't have to wait long. Within minutes, he hears riders approaching cautiously. Through his spyglass, he can make out Wade himself, leading a group of about 6 men. They've seen the smoke and reflections, but they're moving carefully, obviously suspicious of a trap. "Marshal Wade," Jake calls out, letting his voice carry across the darkness. "This is Deputy Marshal Hawkins. Stand down, you're interfering in a federal investigation." He sees Wade and his men pull up short, confused by this new development. Jake allows himself a small smile. He'd known Wade's reputation for violence would work against him here. The deputy marshal can't be sure who might be watching, who might report back about his actions. If he thinks he's stumbled onto another law enforcement operation... "Never heard of no Deputy Marshal Hawkins," Wade shouts back. "That's because this operation has been quiet for 15 years, Jake responds. "Been building a case against Judge Monroe and his organization. Your presence here tonight suggests you might be involved." He sees Wade's men looking at each other uncertainly. "Good! Plant the seeds of doubt. Make them wonder if they're really on the right side." "You're lying!" Wade calls, but there's a note of uncertainty in his voice. "This is my jurisdiction." "Check. Your telegrams," Jake responds calmly. "Orders came down from the territorial capital this morning. Judge Monroe's been under investigation for years. You really think Mason the Hunter turned Prospector by choice?" That gets their attention. Jake can see Wade conferring urgently with his men. The story is just plausible enough to cause doubt. After all, it's a common enough tactic. Law enforcement playing a long game, appearing to retire while actually gathering evidence. "If you're really a marshal," Wade shouts, "come out where we can see you." "Can't do that," Jake replies. "My position's been compromised enough already. But I've got 3 witnesses ready to testify about Monroe's operation, including Marcus Peterson. So I'm giving you one chance, Wade. Walk away now, pretend you never saw us. Otherwise, when this case breaks, a lot of badges are going to be turned in or worse." He sees Wade's men becoming more agitated. They signed on to help a judge catch some outlaws, not to get caught up in a federal investigation. Wade himself seems torn, probably trying to decide if he can risk calling Jake's bluff. Jake decides to push his advantage. He triggers one of his charges, creating a commotion behind the shack that sounds like multiple riders mounting up. "Time's up, Wade," he calls out. "My backup's getting restless. What's it going to be?" For a long moment, the night holds its breath. Then Wade wheels his horse around. "Pull back," he orders his men. "We're riding for Thunder Canyon, now." Jake watches through his spyglass as Wade and his group ride east toward the canyon. Only when they're well away does he allow himself to relax slightly. The gambit worked. Wade will now focus his attention on Thunder Canyon, probably hoping to either find Peterson or eliminate him before any testimony can be given. But there's no time to savor the victory. Jake quickly gathers his equipment, making sure to leave no trace of his deception. The moon is rising, casting enough light to make travel possible. He needs to reach the burial trail before Sarah and Holbrook decide he's not coming. As he mounts up, he allows himself a grim smile. Wade's involvement had seemed like a complication, but it's actually helped advance his plan. Now Monroe's forces are not just divided, but actively suspicious of each other. And while they chase shadows and doubt their own allies, the real threat is slowly closing in. Jake turns his horse north toward the burial grounds. The old Prospector act is done. There's no more need for deception or hiding. Mason the hunter rides again, and this time he's hunting bigger game than ever before. The moon climbs higher, casting his shadow long across the desert floor. Somewhere out there, Sarah and Holbrook are waiting, probably wondering if he's still alive. And beyond them, Peterson hides with his evidence, while Monroe marshals his forces for what he thinks will be a decisive battle in Thunder Canyon. Let them come, Jake thinks. Let them chase ghosts and shoot at shadows. The real reckoning won't happen where they expect and won't play out like they imagine. Because this isn't just about justice anymore. It's about redemption. For Jimmy, for Sarah, for all the lives Monroe has destroyed with his schemes. The hunt is on, and this time the hunter isn't just tracking outlaws. He's tracking corruption itself, following a trail that leads right to the top of the territorial government. And when the dust settles, either justice will be done, or Mason the hunter will have tracked his last prey. Either way, by this time tomorrow, the legend will have its ending. The only question is whether it will be written in justice or in blood. Jake follows Sarah's trail through the maze of cairns, reading signs that would be invisible to less experienced eyes. A deliberately displaced stone here, a scratched mark there. The high trail winds up into the hills, becoming steeper and more treacherous with each passing mile. His horse picks its way carefully through the rocky terrain, but Jake's thoughts are elsewhere. Blackjack's appearance at the burial grounds wasn't a coincidence. Monroe must have figured out at least part of their plan, must have realized they'd use the old trails to avoid his main forces. A sound catches his attention, the soft whisper of falling pebbles somewhere above him. Jake reins in, listening, intently. Could be natural, could be wildlife, or 3 sharp whistles cut through the night air. Sarah's signal. Jake responds with 2 short whistles of his own, then waits. A moment later, Sarah's voice comes from the darkness. "Took your sweet time getting here." She and Holbrook materialize from the shadows of an overhanging rock, their horses ground-tied nearby. Sarah's Winchester is at the ready, and Holbrook looks even more nervous than usual. "Had some business to attend to," Jake responds, dismounting. "Wade's been dealt with, for now. He's leading a group toward Thunder Canyon." "Good," Sarah nods. "But we've got other problems." "Show him, Ray." Holbrook pulls something from his saddlebag, a wanted poster, the ink still fresh. Jake takes it, holding it up to catch the moonlight. His own face stares back at him, along with Sarah's and Holbrook's. The reward amounts are substantial. "Found it tacked to a tree about an hour back," Holbrook explains. "They're not even pretending anymore. Says we're wanted for murder, theft, and conspiracy against the territorial government." Jake studies the poster carefully. Monroe's not wasting any time. "How many copies, you figure, are already out there?" "Enough," Sarah says grimly. "Riders must have left Serpent's Gap with these right after the fight at the mission. By morning, they'll be posted in every town within 50 miles. Changes things, Jake admits, folding the poster and tucking it into his jacket. Legal posses will be joining the hunt now. Monroe's men we can handle, but regular lawmen just doing their job. We need to tell them the truth, Holbrook interrupts. About Monroe, about Peterson's evidence. If they knew what was really happening, they'd still have to bring us in. Jake cuts him off. That's their job. Besides, Monroe's got too many friends in high places. Any lawman who tries to help us would likely wind up dead. Sarah checks her Winchester's load, a habit Jake recognizes from the old days when tension was high. So, what's the play? You said we're not heading for Santa Fe or the Jesuit mission. Where are we really going? Jake moves to the edge of the trail, looking out over the moonlit desert below. From this height he can see for miles. No pursuit visible yet, but that won't last. There's a place, he says slowly. Something Jimmy told me about. Right before the end. A hidden canyon, deep in Apache territory. Sacred ground even older than these burial grounds. Place where their holy men used to hide their most important secrets. Jimmy never mentioned any canyon like that to me, Sarah's voice carries a hint of doubt. No, he wouldn't have. He knew how dangerous the knowledge was. Jake turns back to face them. But he told me that last night. Said if things went wrong, if the truth ever needed to be protected, that canyon was the safest place in the territory. No white man had ever found it except him. And that's where Peterson is? Holbrook asks. Jake shakes his head. Peterson's exactly where I said, waiting at a mission. Just not the one Monroe's men are watching. There's another mission, one that doesn't appear on any maps, built by Spanish priests who went native, who learned the Apache ways. It's in that hidden canyon. Sarah's eyes widened in understanding. The lost mission of Santa Muerte. Jimmy used to tell stories about it, but I thought they were just legends. Most legends have a grain of truth, Jake responds. In this case, the truth is that the mission exists and it's been serving as a sanctuary for centuries, a place where secrets can be kept safe, where justice can find a way. And you've known about this all along? Holbrook sounds almost accusatory. Why not tell us earlier? Because knowledge is power, Jake says simply, and power has a way of corrupting even the best intentions. The fewer people who know about the canyon, the safer it stays. He pauses. Besides, we weren't ready earlier, weren't committed to seeing this through, no matter the cost. And now we are, Sarah asks quietly. Jake pulls out his old pocket watch, checking the time. Sun'll be up in about 4 hours. By then, Monroe's men will have figured out we're not heading for Thunder Canyon or Santa Fe. They'll start widening their search, maybe even bring in Apache scouts who know this country. So we need to reach this canyon before dawn, Holbrook concludes. No, Jake corrects him. We need to make them think we're heading somewhere else entirely. He turns to Sarah. Remember how Jimmy used to say the best way to hide something was to make people think they'd already found it? A slow smile spreads across Sarah's face. The shell game. Make them think they've discovered our real destination. Let them commit their forces to the wrong place. Exactly. Jake pulls out his remaining signal flares. We're going to give Monroe's men, the law, and anyone else who's hunting us exactly what they expect. A desperate group of fugitives trying to reach Mexico before the net closes. While we go the opposite direction, Holbrook nods, beginning to understand. Into Apache territory, where no one would expect us to run. But we'll need to split up again, Sarah realizes. Someone has to lay the false trail, make it convincing. Jake meets her eyes steadily. I taught you everything I know about tracking, Sarah. Everything except one thing, how to hide a trail so well that even I can't follow it. Time you learned that last lesson. Sarah's face shows a mix of emotions. Understanding, concern, and something else. Something that might be fear, not for herself, but for him. You're going to play decoy, she says. It's not a question. Monroe wants me more than either of you, Jake confirms. His pride's been hurt. He'll commit most of his forces to chasing me, especially if I make it look like I'm trying to reach Peterson and escape south. It's suicide, Holbrook protests. Maybe. Jake agrees, but it's our best chance. While they're chasing me, you two can reach the canyon with minimal risk. Peterson's evidence will be safe, and more importantly, you'll both be alive to make sure it reaches the right hands. Sarah steps closer to him, her voice low and intense. We didn't come this far together just to split up now. There has to be another way. There isn't. Jake's voice is gentle but firm. Sometimes the only way to win is to be willing to lose everything. Jimmy understood that. It's time we did too. The night wind whispers through the ancient cairns, carrying with it the weight of 15 years of waiting, planning, and sacrifice. Above them, the stars wheel in their eternal dance, indifferent to the dramas playing out beneath them. Finally, Sarah nods, though her eyes are bright with unshed tears. How long do you think you can keep them chasing shadows? Long enough, Jake promises. I've got a few more tricks they haven't seen yet. Besides, he adds with a grim smile, they're not just chasing an old prospector anymore. They're hunting Mason the Hunter, and that's a whole different kind of game. He begins dividing their supplies, making sure Sarah and Holbrook have what they need for the journey ahead. As he works, he can feel the weight of history pressing down on them. Not just their own history, but the history of this ancient land and all the secrets it holds. The hunt is entering its final phase, but the hunters and hunted are no longer so clearly defined. In the desert night, under the watching eyes of ancient spirits, the lines between justice and revenge, between right and wrong, begin to blur. Dawn is coming, and with it, the final act of a drama 15 years in the making. The only question is who will be left standing when the dust settles and the last shot echoes across the sacred ground. The shot echoes through the passage, chips of stone stinging Jake's face as the bullet strikes the wall beside him. He doesn't return fire immediately. Patience was always what set him apart from other hunters. Instead, he studies the way the dust motes dance in the shaft of sunlight ahead. The shooter's position betrays itself in the subtle disruption of that dust. That's close enough, Mason. The voice belongs to one of Wade's deputies, young, trying to sound confident but betraying nervousness in every syllable. We've got both ends of this passage covered. Jake allows himself a small smile. The deputy's voice came from slightly above and to the right. There must be a ledge up there that doesn't show on old Spanish maps. Just one problem with that, son, Jake calls back, carefully measuring the distance in his mind. You're assuming this passage only has two ends. He spurts his horse forward suddenly, but instead of riding straight ahead, he guides the animal into what appears to be a solid wall. The deputy's second shot goes wide as Jake and his mount seemingly vanish into the rock face. It's an old Apache. Trick! The wall is actually an illusion created by carefully stacked stones, easily knocked aside by a horse's weight. Jake emerges into a secondary passage, one that runs parallel to the main one. The deputy's startled curse tells Jake all he needs to know about the man's experience level. Time to press that advantage. He draws his gun and fires twice, not at the deputy, but at specific points in the rock wall. The bullets ricochet with terrible screeching sounds, multiplied by the passage's acoustics. More cursing, followed by the scramble of boots on stone as the deputy abandons his position. Jake continues riding, counting under his breath. 3, 2, 1. The explosion of the percussion cap he'd planted earlier fills the passage with smoke and confusion. From the deputy's perspective, it must seem like he's under attack from multiple directions. Jake emerges from the secondary passage into bright sunlight just as more riders appear on the horizon. He recognizes the lead rider instantly. Ray, Holbrook's replacement as Monroe's chief enforcer, a man called the Preacher. because he always says a prayer before killing his targets. The preacher's presence changes things. Unlike the deputy, this man knows what he's doing. He's also known for being absolutely ruthless in pursuit of his quarry. Time to implement the next phase of the plan. Jake wheels his horse toward Monroe's ranch, making sure the preacher and his men get a good view of him. Then he pulls out something he's been saving for just this moment. A saddlebag bearing the territorial marshal's office seal. The reaction is immediate. The preacher spurs his horse forward, no doubt recognizing the bag as potentially containing Peterson's evidence. His men follow, spreading out in a standard pursuit formation. Jake leads them on a carefully planned route, one that takes them past several key locations. First, a waterhole where he's spent the past 15 years casually mentioning to anyone who would listen that he'd seen strange lights at night. Then past an abandoned mine shaft that local legend says connects to a vast network of underground tunnels. Each location adds another layer to the story he's building, the desperate tale of a man who's hidden damning evidence in multiple places, trying to reach one final cache before escaping south. The preacher's men fire occasionally, but their shots are meant to herd rather than kill. They want him alive, want him to lead them to the supposed evidence. Jake obligingly plays his part, showing just enough desperation to be convincing. A movement catches his eye, riders on a distant ridge, moving parallel to their course. For a moment his heart stops, thinking Sarah and Holbrook have been discovered. But no, these are Apache scouts, still following but keeping their distance after the Sacred Ground incident. Jake reaches into his jacket and removes a small leather pouch, one he'd taken from a dead medicine man years ago with the tribe's blessing. Inside are sacred herbs and blessed tobacco. He empties the pouch as he rides, letting the wind carry the contents toward the Apache scouts. The effect is immediate. The scouts pull up short, recognizing the ritual offering. Jake adds the final touch, raising his hand in a specific gesture, one that marks him as someone who knows the old ways, the secret paths. The scouts wheel their horses and ride away. They might be working for Wade, but there are some lines even paid allies won't cross. Jake has just marked himself as under spiritual protection, making him taboo to any Apache warrior who follows the traditional ways. The preacher, watching this exchange through his brass spyglass, clearly doesn't understand the significance, but he's smart enough to know he's just lost valuable allies. "That won't save you, Mason," he shouts. "There's nowhere left to run." Jake responds by leading them into the next phase of his plan, a winding canyon that leads straight toward Monroe's ranch. As they ride, he begins dropping things. A folded map here, a torn letter there, pieces of a false trail that will keep Monroe's men busy for days. But the preacher isn't so easily fooled. He orders his men to split up, some following Jake's trail, while others move to cut off possible escape routes. It's exactly what Jake would have done in his position, which is why he's prepared for it. The canyon narrows, forcing the riders into single file. Jake reaches into his saddlebag one last time, removing something that took him 15 years to perfect. A replica of Peterson's journal, carefully aged and filled with just enough real information to be convincing. He makes a show of checking. It then tucks it securely away. Behind him he hears the preacher shouting new orders. They've seen the journal just as he intended. The chase is about to enter its final phase. The sun is climbing higher, and soon the real test will begin. Because Monroe's ranch isn't just a convenient destination. It's where Wade will be heading once he realizes Thunder Canyon is a dead end. All the pieces are moving into place. The only question is whether Jake can keep this deadly dance going long enough for Sarah and Holbrook to complete their mission. He checks his ammunition again, 4 rounds left in his gun, 8 more on his belt. Not much, but then again, Mason the Hunter never needed much to get the job done. The ranch buildings appear on the horizon, Monroe's pride and joy, built with money stolen from honest settlers and protected by men who've sold their souls for gold. Time to remind them that some things are worth more than gold. Some things, like justice, have a price that can only be paid in blood. Jake Mason spurs his horse forward toward what might be his final showdown. Behind him, the preacher and his men follow, thinking they're running down a desperate fugitive. They're about to learn that sometimes the hunter and the hunted are the same thing. And in this devil's dance, the music is about to reach its crescendo. Jake dismounts at the house's front steps, ducking as bullets chip away at the whitewashed walls around him. Inside, he can hear Monroe shouting orders, the sound of furniture being overturned, papers being destroyed. "Mason!" Marshal Evans' voice carries over the chaos. "Wait for backup," but 15 years of waiting are enough. Jake kicks in the front door, rolling to one side, as a shotgun blast tears through the space where he'd been standing. One of Monroe's personal guards drops the smoking weapon, scrambling to reload, but Jake's faster. One shot, and the guard goes down. 3 rounds left. The house's interior is a maze of expensive furniture and imported artwork. Jake moves through it like a ghost, hearing movement on the floor above. Behind him, federal marshals are securing the ground floor, but he doesn't wait for them. The stairs creak under his weight as he climbs. Another guard appears at the top, firing wildly. Jake's return shot catches him in the shoulder, spinning him back into the wall. 2 rounds left. "It's over, Monroe," Jake calls out, advancing down the upper hallway. "Federal marshals have the house surrounded. Apache warriors are keeping your men pinned down. No one's coming to help." "You think you've won?" Monroe's voice comes from behind. "A closed door. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Mason. I own half the territorial government. One telegram to the right people." "Those telegrams won't help you," Jake interrupts, moving closer to the door. "While you were focusing on Peterson on Thunder Canyon, federal agents were moving through every major city in the territory. You're have friends in high places. They're all being arrested right now." A crash from inside the room, the sound of breaking glass. Jake kicks the door open to find Monroe at his desk, feeding documents into a small stove. The judge's fancy clothes are stained with the red war powder, his eyes red and streaming. "Stay back!" Monroe raises a derringer. "I'll kill you where you stand." Jake's gun is already pointed. 2 rounds left, Judge. 1 for you, 1 for insurance. Your choice how this ends." "Choice?" Monroe's laugh is borderline hysterical. "You want to talk about choices? I chose to build something here, to bring progress to this backward territory. Everything I did, every life I took, it was for the greater good." "Tell that to Jimmy Hawkins," Jake says quietly. "Tell that to all. The homesteaders you forced out, all the witnesses you silenced. Hawkins was a fool." Monroe's hand shakes as he points to the derringer. "He could have been rich, could have had everything. Instead, he chose to die for his precious principles." "No," Jake's voice carries an edge of steel. "You chose to kill him, just like you chose to kill Marshal Phillips when he got too close. Just like you would have killed Peterson if you'd found him." More footsteps on the stairs, the federal marshals making their way up, but Monroe doesn't seem to hear them. His eyes are fixed on Jake, filled with a mixture of hatred and something else, something like fear. 15 years, Monroe says, softly. 15 years you played the broken-down prospector, made everyone think you were searching these hills for gold. His face twists in sudden understanding. But you were building something else, weren't you? Building a case, piece by piece, using my own arrogance against me. Jake nods slowly. A man like you, Judge, you couldn't resist watching the mighty Mason the Hunter reduced to digging in the dirt. Couldn't resist letting me wander your territory, thinking I was harmless. And Sarah Hawkins, was she part of your plan too? Sarah made her own choices, Jake responds. Just like Jimmy did, just like you did. Monroe's finger tightens on the derringer's trigger. One last choice then. One last, the shot seems deafening in the confined space. Monroe staggers back, the derringer falling from nerveless fingers. Red spreads across his expensive vest. Not the war powder this time, but blood. 1 round left. You shot me. Monroe sounds more surprised than anything else. No choice about it, Jake says quietly. Some men can't be brought to justice alive. Some debts can only be paid in blood. Monroe slumps against his desk, scattering the documents he'd been trying to burn. His breath comes in ragged gasps as federal marshals finally burst into the room. Marshal Evans, Jake acknowledges without turning. Judge Monroe appears to have resisted arrest. Had to defend myself. Evans surveys the scene, the wounded judge, the scattered documents, the smoking gun in Jake's hand. After a long moment, he nods. Seems clear enough, self-defense given the circumstances. Monroe's laugh turns into a wet cough. Circumstances? You have no idea. What's really... His voice trails off as his eyes glaze over. Jake holsters his gun, the last round. Unfired. 15 years of planning, of waiting, of building an airtight case, and in the end it came down to this. 1 bullet, 1 moment of final justice. Outside, the shooting has died down. The Apache warriors, their point made, have melted back into the hills. Wade and his deputies are surrendering to the federal marshals, while the preacher's men are either captured or fled. Sarah and Holbrook? Evans asks quietly. Should be reaching the real Peterson by now, Jake responds. Everything in that journal Wade was reading. Copies, the real evidence, the documents that'll bring down Monroe's entire organization. They're all safely hidden. Evans nods approvingly. Phillips would be proud. This was his operation originally, wasn't it? Before Monroe had him killed? Phillips started it, Jake confirms. I just finished it. For him, for Jimmy, for all the others who died trying to expose the truth. He moves to the window, looking out over the yard where it all ended. The morning sun has climbed higher, burning away the last traces of the red war powder. Below, federal marshals are leading away Monroe's men in chains, while others secure the ranch and gather evidence. 15 years of playing a role, of being less than he was, all leading to this moment. The mighty Mason the Hunter, reduced to digging in the dirt, exactly what Monroe had wanted to see, never suspecting that every hole dug, every claim worked, was part of a larger plan. What now? Evans asks. Jake checks his gun out of habit. 1 round left, 1 last piece of insurance, in case things had gone differently. Now? Now we make sure the truth comes out. All of it. Every crooked deal, every murder, every corrupt official who helped Monroe build his empire. And after that, Jake smiles slightly. After that, maybe I'll do some real prospecting. These hills still have secrets to share, if a man knows where to look. The devil's dance is over, but the music of justice plays on, and somewhere out there, Sarah Hawkins is riding towards safety with the evidence that will finish what her brother started. Sometimes the longest hunts are the most satisfying. Sometimes justice takes its time, but arrives all the same. And sometimes the best revenge is letting your enemy think they've won, right up until the moment they realize they've lost everything. As the afternoon wears on, more riders arrive. At Monroe's ranch, local lawmen, territorial officials, even a few newspaper men drawn by rumors of the judge's fall. Jake watches them from his vantage point, noting how the power structure is already shifting, realigning itself in the wake of Monroe's death. Vultures, Sarah observes, still standing beside him, already picking at the carcass. A part of the process, Jake responds. Territory needs to see this, needs to understand what happened here. Otherwise, someone else will just step into Monroe's shoes. Marshal Evans approaches with a stack of documents. Found these in a hidden safe. Property deeds, blackmail material, records of payoffs to territorial officials. He shakes his head grimly. Monroe's reach went deeper than we thought. Any mention of Jimmy's case? Sarah asks. Several pages, Evans confirms. Seems the judge kept detailed records of everyone he corrupted or eliminated. Your brother's name appears multiple times, along with Marshal Phillips and others who got too close to the truth. Jake takes the documents, scanning them quickly. Names we knew about, and some we didn't. This'll keep federal investigators busy. For months. Years, more likely, Evans corrects. We're already getting telegrams from other territories, other jurisdictions. Seems Monroe's organization had connections everywhere. A commotion from the yard draws their attention. One of Monroe's former guards is causing trouble, refusing to get into the prison wagon. Jake recognizes him, a brutal man known for handling the judge's special problems. Sarah's hand moves to her new badge, but Jake stops her with a gentle touch. Let the federal boys handle it. Time to let others do the heavy lifting. They watch as marshals subdue the guard, noting how the other prisoners seem to be distancing themselves from him. The old power structure is crumbling, former allies turning on each other in hopes of leniency. Speaking of heavy lifting, Evans turns to Jake. There's the matter of Peterson's evidence, the documents he took when he fled, the ones that started all this. Safe at the mission, Jake assures him, but that's not the whole story. Peterson didn't just take documents about Monroe's land schemes. He took proof of something bigger. Sarah's eyes narrow. Bigger than stealing half the territory. Jake nods slowly. Monroe was just one part of a larger organization. Corrupt judges, territorial officials, even some federal appointees, all working together to control development across multiple territories. Peterson found evidence of their entire operation. That's why they were so desperate to find him, Evans realizes. Not just to protect Monroe, but to protect the whole network. And that's why we needed 15 years, Jake continues. Time to identify every member, track every connection. Monroe's death isn't the end. It's just the beginning of a much larger cleanup operation. Sarah absorbs this information, her hand unconsciously touching the marshal's badge in her pocket. So that's why you're really giving me the badge. You're not done hunting. The territory needs someone they can trust, Jake says simply. Someone who understands what we're really fighting against. While Evans and his men follow the paper trail, while federal investigators dig through Monroe's records, you'll be out there, Sarah finishes, following the trails that don't show up in official reports. Jake's hand drops to his gun, to that final round. Some hunts can't be conducted with badges and warrants. Some predators need to be tracked by someone who knows their ways. Evans clears his throat uncomfortably. Officially, of course, the federal marshal's office can't condone any unofficial investigations. Officially, Jake agrees with a slight smile. Just like officially, Monroe died resisting arrest. Sometimes official stories are better than the truth. The sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across Monroe's empire. In the yard below, the last of the prisoners are being loaded into wagons. Deputies are cataloguing evidence, taking statements, beginning the long process of untangling 15 years of corruption. What about the Apache? Sarah asks suddenly. Their help today wasn't just about sacred powder, was it? Jake shakes his head. Made some friends during my prospecting years, learned their ways, earned their trust. They've been watching Monroe's operation too, seeing how his corruption was poisoning their lands. And now? Now they'll go back to their hills, Jake says. Keep watching, keep waiting. The territory's changing, but some things stay the same. The old ways, the sacred places, they'll endure long after Monroe's empire is forgotten. A rider appears on the horizon, approaching fast. Jake recognizes the silhouette, Holbrook, returning from the mission. Peterson's safely delivered. He reports as he dismounts. Federal escorts got him to the courthouse ahead of schedule. He's already giving his deposition. Sarah studies the former enforcer thoughtfully. And what about you, Ray? Which side are you choosing now? Holbrook meets her gaze steadily. Already made my choice. Told the federal investigators everything I know about Monroe's operation. Figure maybe it's time to try being one of the good guys for a change. Good guys, bad guys, Jake muses. Out here, the line isn't always so clear. What matters is the choices we make, the promises we keep. He pulls out his pocket watch, the same one he checked 15 years ago, waiting for word of Jimmy's execution. Its face is scratched, its hands worn, but it still keeps perfect time. Sun's getting low. He observes. Time for decisions. Sarah touches her badge again, then straightens her shoulders. I'll need deputies I can trust. People who understand what we're really fighting against. Holbrook nods slowly. Could I know some folks? Good men who worked for Monroe because they didn't see another choice? Might be willing to switch sides. Now they've seen which way the wind's blowing. And you, Sarah asks Jake, where will you start? Jake looks out over the territory, the hills where he played Prospector, the trails where he tracked Monroe's men, the sacred places where old ghosts still walk. There's a town up north, he says finally. Another judge, just like Monroe. Been watching him for years, gathering evidence. Maybe it's time to pay him a visit. As Mason the Hunter? Evans asks. No, Jake smiles slightly. Think I'll try prospecting. Again. Amazing what people will say around a broken-down old man who's just looking for gold. The sun touches the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire. Below, the wagon train of prisoners begins its journey toward justice. Sarah's badge catches the last rays of daylight, throwing back a promise of change, of hope for something better. Jake's gun still holds that final round, but maybe it won't be needed. Maybe the territory really is ready for something new. Either way, the hunt goes on. Not for revenge now, but for the future Jimmy Hawkins died believing in. Some ghosts can finally rest. Others still cry out for justice, and in the gathering dusk, Mason the Hunter saddles up for one last ride into legend. 3 days after Monroe's fall, Jake Mason rides alone through Serpent's Gap. The town has changed already. There's a new energy in the air, a sense of possibility now that the judge's shadow no longer hangs over everything. He reins in at the Last Chance Saloon, the same place where this final chapter began. Tom the bartender is still there, polishing glasses just like he was when Blackjack's men first confronted the old prospector. Heard about Monroe, Tom says as Jake enters. Heard about a lot of things, actually. Federal marshals have been through here, asking questions about land deals, property transfers. That's so? Jake settles at the bar, ordering water just like before. Interesting times. Interesting ain't the half of it. Tom leans forward conspiratorially. They're saying Mason the Hunter was behind it all. 15 years of playing Prospector, building a case against the judge. Hard to believe. Jake sips his water. People believe what they want to believe. Truth's usually somewhere in between the stories. The saloon doors swing open, admitting Sarah Hawkins. The marshal's badge gleams on her vest, and she carries herself differently now. More purpose in her stride, more authority in her bearing. Thought. I'd find you here, she says, settling beside Jake. Lot of work to be done. Always is. Jake studies her reflection in the bar mirror. How's the new job treating you? Busy. Holbrook's been helping, identifying Monroe's old allies, sorting out which ones can be turned and which need to be watched. She accepts a glass of water from Tom. Found some interesting documents in the judge's safe. Names of other officials in other territories, all part of the same organization. Dangerous information, Jake observes. That's why I'm here. Sarah turns to face him fully. Federal Marshal's office is setting up a special unit, off the books, unofficial, dedicated to tracking down the rest of Monroe's network. Sounds like important work. They want you to lead it. Sarah watches his reaction carefully. Your experience, your reputation could do a lot of good. Jake is silent for a long moment, considering. Finally, he says, Badges and title never really suited me. Better to work in the shadows, where some folks might still mistake an old prospector for harmless. Figured you'd say that. Sarah pulls out a folded paper. That's why I brought this special authorization from the Federal Marshal's Office. Gives you complete autonomy, resources when you need them, but no official position. A hunter needs to move freely, Jake agrees, taking the paper. Follow trails wherever they lead. Speaking of trails, Sarah lowers her voice. Got word about that judge up north you mentioned. Seems he's been making some interesting land purchases lately. Same pattern as Monroe. Jake pockets the authorization. Might be worth looking into. Territory's changing. I need to make sure it changes the right way this time. The saloon has begun filling up as evening approaches. Among the patrons are some of Monroe's former men, now wearing deputy badges under Sarah's authority. They nod respectfully to their new marshal while carefully avoiding Jake's gaze. Heard from Peterson, Sarah continues. Federal prosecutors are building cases against Monroe's entire network. Going to take time, but changes are coming. Changes already here, Jake observes. Look around, people walking taller, speaking more freely. Amazing what happens when fear lifts. Sarah touches her badge thoughtfully. Jimmy would have liked to see this, the territory he died believing in, finally starting to take shape. He sees it, Jake says quietly. Through you, through what you're building here. Justice isn't just about hunting down the wicked. It's about protecting what's right, giving good people a chance to thrive. A young man enters the saloon looking around nervously. Jake recognizes him, one of the cowboys who used to mock the old prospector. Now he approaches cautiously, hat in hand. Marshal Hawkins, he addresses Sarah. Got word from up near Thunder Canyon. Some strangers have been asking questions about the old copper mine, about Monroe's operations. Thought you should know. Sarah glances at Jake. Already starting, isn't it? New predators moving in, testing the waters. Nature abhors a vacuum, Jake agrees. Monroe's fall left a lot of territory up for grabs. Lot of ambitious men thinking, they might be the next big power. Then I guess we both have work to do. Sarah stands. You hunting shadows in the north. Me making sure what happened here never happens again. Jake finishes his water and rises. Territory's big enough for both kinds of justice. The official kind, he nods to her badge, and the kind that works best unseen. They step out onto the boardwalk together. The sun is setting behind the hills, where Jake spent 15 years playing Prospector, building his case piece by piece. Those same hills now hold new secrets, new trails to follow. You'll keep in touch? Sarah asks. Let me know what you find up north. When I can, Jake responds. Some hunts take time, need to develop slow. But if I find something that needs official attention, I'll be here, she promises, building something Jimmy would be proud of. Jake mounts up, checking his gun out of habit. That last round is still there, still waiting. Maybe it won't be needed in this new territory they're building, or maybe some ghosts still need putting to rest, some predators still need hunting. One more thing, Sarah calls as he turns his horse. That last bullet, the one you didn't use on Monroe. Are you ever going to tell me what it was really for? Jake looks back at her, seeing not just the new marshal, but the sister of a man who died for justice. Insurance, he says simply. In case things went wrong, in case Monroe's friends needed a message they couldn't ignore. And now? Now? Jake's smile is slight but genuine. Now it's a reminder that justice is never really finished, that there's always one more hunt, one more wrong to right. He touches the brim of his hat. Take care of your town, Marshal Hawkins. I'll be seeing you. As he rides north into the gathering dusk, Jake Mason feels the weight of his gun, of that final round that represents both threat and promise. Monroe's fall was just the beginning. Out there in the territory, other corrupt men are building their empires, thinking themselves untouchable. Let them think that. Let them believe the old stories about Mason the Hunter are just that, stories. Let them dismiss tales of an old prospector who spent 15 years building the perfect trap. The hunt goes on. The territory changes. And somewhere between justice and vengeance, between badge and bullet, the legend continues to grow. For every Monroe brought down, another rises to take his place. But now they'll have to deal with two kinds of justice: the shining badge of Marshal Sarah Hawkins and the shadowy presence of a hunter who's learned patience is the deadliest weapon of all. The last light fades from the sky as Jake Mason rides into legend once more. Behind him, Serpent's Gap settles into its new reality. Ahead lies another hunt, another chance to make things right. And that final round waits, patient as the hunter who carries it, for the moment when justice demands its due. Before leaving Serpent's Gap entirely, Jake makes one final stop. On the outskirts of town sits a small cemetery, and in it a marker he's visited every year for 15 years. Jimmy Hawkins' grave is simple, just a wooden cross with a name and date, but it's been well tended. He dismounts, noting fresh flowers already placed there. Sarah must have visited earlier. "It's done, Jimmy," he says quietly to the grave. "Monroe's gone. His organization's crumbling. Your sister's wearing a badge now, the kind of badge you always said this territory needed." The evening wind whispers through the scrub brush, carrying the scent of sage and desert flowers. Jake removes his hat, studying the cross thoughtfully. 15 years ago, you trusted me with more than just evidence. You trusted me with a vision of what this territory could be, of what justice really means. Took a long time, but that vision's starting to take shape. He reaches into his jacket and pulls out the marshal's authorization Sarah gave him. Funny how things work out. All those years playing Prospector, and now they want to make it official. Sort of. Special investigator, they're calling it. Free to operate in the shadows, but with the law's backing when needed. A horse whinnies. In the distance, probably his own mount getting restless. But Jake's not finished here yet. Your sister asked about this last bullet, he continued, touching his gun. Truth is, it was meant for Monroe, right up until the end. Not to kill him, to wound him, make him run. The kind of shot that would have forced him to flee into Apache territory, where old debts and ancient justice were waiting. He smiles slightly. But sometimes the simple ending is the right one. Monroe died thinking he'd lost everything to an old prospector's luck. Never knew about the federal investigations, the years of groundwork, all the pieces we put in place. Never knew how many people worked together to bring him down. The sun has almost disappeared now, leaving just a faint glow on the western horizon. In town, lights are beginning to appear in windows, and the sound of piano music drifts from the saloon. Things are changing fast, Jake tells the grave. Marshal Evans is setting up a special task force dedicated to rooting out corruption across all territories. Sarah's building a new kind of law enforcement here, one based on justice rather than power. Even some of Monroe's old men are switching sides, trying to be part of something better. He pauses, considering his next words carefully. But there's still work to do. That judge up north, he's just the tip of the iceberg. Monroe's organization spread far and wide, corrupting everything it touched. Going to take years to clean it all up. A figure appears at the cemetery gate, Holbrook now wearing a deputy's badge under Sarah's authority. He waits respectfully at a distance, understanding the importance of this moment. "Your death wasn't the end, Jimmy," Jake continues. "It was the beginning. You showed us that one man standing up for what's right can change everything. Took 15 years, but that change is finally here." He replaces his hat, then reaches into his pocket and removes something small, a marshal's badge, old and tarnished. The same one he took from a corrupt lawman years ago. "Think it's time this found a proper home," he says, placing the badge at the base of the cross. "A reminder of what we're fighting for and against." Holbrook approaches as Jake straightens up. "Marshal Hawkins sent me. Got word about some suspicious activity up near Thunder Canyon. Might be connected to that northern judge you mentioned." "Jake, Nods, unsurprised. They're moving fast, trying to fill the power vacuum Monroe left behind, testing boundaries, looking for weaknesses. Want some company? Holbrook offers. Sarah said I could ride with you if you needed backup. This kind of hunting works better alone, Jake responds. Besides, Sarah needs good deputies here, people who understand what we're building. Holbrook studies him thoughtfully. You really think we can change things? Make the territory what Jimmy dreamed about? Already happening, Jake gestures toward town. Look around. People walking taller, speaking freely, land claims being processed fairly, law applying equally to rich and poor alike. Because of you, Holbrook observes, because you spent 15 years setting this up. Jake shakes his head. Because of everyone who refused to accept corruption as normal. Jimmy, Sarah, Marshall Phillips, Peterson, even you, choosing to switch sides when it mattered most. They walk together toward their horses. In town, the saloon is filling up, but it's different now. No more armed guards watching the doors, no more corrupt officials demanding special treatment. Just people living their lives free from fear. One more thing, Holbrook says as Jake mounts up. Sarah wanted me to give you this. He hands up a small package wrapped in oil paper. Jake opens it to find a brand new pocket watch. It's silver. Case engraved with a simple message. Justice takes time. Tell her thanks, Jake says, tucking the watch away. And tell her Jimmy would be proud of everything she's building here. What about you? Holbrook asks. Will you be back? Jake gathers his reins, looking north toward new horizons. When needed, some hunts take time and need to develop slowly. But this territory's changing, and change needs both kinds of justice. The kind that wears a badge in the sunlight, and the kind that works best in the shadows. He touches his gun one last time, feeling the weight of that final round. Not just insurance anymore. Now it's a promise that what they've started here won't end with Monroe's fall. The stars are coming out as Jake Mason rides north, leaving Serpent's Gap and its ghosts behind. Ahead lies another hunt, another chance to make things right. And somewhere out there, corrupt men are building their empires, thinking themselves safe from justice's reach. Let them think that. Let them dismiss rumors of an old prospector who appears in town, asking innocent questions about land deals and property transfers. Let them laugh at stories of Mason the Hunter's return. The hunt goes on, the territory changes, and in the gathering darkness, a legend rides toward justice once more. 1 month after Monroe's fall, a lone rider approaches a small town in the Northern Territory. The town of Eagles Crossing sits in the shadow of Judge Harrison's mansion, much like Serpent's Gap once cowered under Monroe's influence. The rider's clothes are dusty, his horse trail-worn, and his manner that of a simple prospector looking for a place to rest. The Eagles Rest Saloon falls quiet as Jake Mason pushes through its doors. He notes the similarities to the Last Chance. Back in Serpent's Gap, the armed men watching the entrance, the nervous glances from patrons, the heavy atmosphere of fear barely contained. "Water," he orders, placing a coin on the bar. His voice carries the same quaver he used for 15 years, playing the role that fooled Monroe for so long. The bartender, a heavy-set man with nervous eyes, fills a glass. "Passing through?" "Might be," Jake responds, maintaining his prospector's persona. "Heard there might be some good claims up in these parts." Of course, that was before I heard about all the changes down south. The saloon's atmosphere shifts subtly. Everyone's heard about Monroe's fall, about the federal investigations spreading across the territory like wildfire. Jake catches whispered conversations, sees the way Judge Harrison's men grip their guns a little tighter. Changes come and go, the bartender says carefully. Judge Harrison keeps things stable here. Keep the peace. Jake takes a slow sip of water, letting his hands shake slightly. Just another old man, harmless and forgettable. Heard some interesting stories about peacekeeping down south. Federal marshals cleaning house, they say. New marshal in Serpent's Gap, woman name of Hawkins. The name draws attention from a corner table where several well-dressed men are playing cards. One of them, wearing an expensive suit and a judge's watch chain, studies Jake with newly focused interest. "You're from Serpent's Gap?" the man asks, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Eastern education. Judge Harrison himself, Jake realizes. Monroe's old friend and fellow conspirator. Passed through there, Jake maintains his doddering persona. Quite a story they tell about Monroe. 15 years of thinking he had some old prospector fooled, never suspecting the man was building a case against him the whole time. Harrison's laugh is forced. Tall tales, my friend. Monroe's death was a simple matter of resisting arrest. These stories about Mason the Hunter returning from retirement, pure fiction, designed to sell newspapers. Could be, Jake agrees amiably, though I did see something interesting up near Thunder Canyon last week. Bunch of riders meeting in secret discussing property deals and railroad routes. Reminds me of stories they tell about Monroe's operation. The saloon goes deadly quiet. Harrison's hand tightens on his whiskey glass, his knuckles white. Thunder Canyon, you say? Dangerous country up there. Man could have accidents, seeing things he shouldn't. "Oh, I'm careful about what I see," Jake assures him, letting a hint of fear creep into his voice. "Just like I'm careful about those papers I found, the ones with all those interesting signatures and seals." Harrison stands slowly, his guards moving to flank him. "Perhaps we should discuss your findings in private. My office is just across the street." "That's mighty kind," Jake responds, maintaining his nervous demeanor. "Though I should mention, I sent copies of those papers to some friends. Marshal Hawkins down in Serpent's Gap, for one, and that federal investigator, the one who's been asking questions about Monroe's old associates." The judge's face darkens. "You're either very brave or very foolish, old man. Do you know who I am? What can I do?" "Just a simple prospector," Jake says, his voice still trembling, but his pale eyes suddenly sharp as steel. "Though folks used to call me by another name, back when I was hunting men instead of gold." Recognition dawns in Harrison's eyes. His hand moves toward his gun, but Jake's is already drawn, appearing as if by magic. "You're him," Harrison breathes. "Mason the Hunter. The stories were true." "Stories usually are," Jake agrees, his prospector's quaver gone, replaced by the hard voice that once struck fear into outlaws across the territory. "Just like the stories about your connection to Monroe, about your part in his organization, about all the witnesses who disappeared after asking too many questions." Harrison's guards reach for their weapons, but Jake's gun doesn't waver. "I wouldn't," he advises them. "This old prospector's got one round left, been saving it for something special. Question is, which one of you wants to test whether you're worth that bullet?" "What do you want?" Harrison demands. "Same thing I wanted from Monroe," Jake responds. "Justice, truth, change." He nods toward the window. "And if you're thinking about those men you've got watching the street, don't bother. They're a bit occupied." At the moment, as if on cue, shouting erupts outside. Through the window, they can see federal marshals moving into position, led by a familiar figure wearing a bright star. Sarah Hawkins, come north to help finish what they started. "You see, Judge," Jake continues conversationally, "Monroe thought he was just dealing with one old hunter, never realized he was facing something bigger. A partnership between official justice and the kind that works best in shadows. Just like you never realized your secret meeting at Thunder Canyon was watched by both kinds." Harrison sinks back into his chair, the fight draining from him as he realizes the depth of the trap. "How long?" he asks quietly. "How long have you been watching me?" "Long enough," Jake responds. "While Monroe kept everyone's attention down south, we've been building cases against his entire network. Every corrupt judge, every bought official, every land scheme and railroad deal." The saloon. Doors burst open as Sarah enters, followed by federal marshals. "Judge Harrison," she announces formally, "you're under arrest for corruption, conspiracy, and multiple counts of murder." As the marshals move to secure Harrison and his men, Jake holsters his gun, that final round still unfired. Sarah approaches him, a slight smile on her face. "Didn't take you long to find trouble up here," she observes. "Trouble has a way of finding me," Jake responds, "though it helps when you know where to look." He nods toward Harrison as the judge is led away in chains. One more piece of Monroe's network. Dismantled. "How many more?" Sarah asks. Jake pulls out his new watch, the one she gave him, checking the time. "According to Peterson's evidence, at least a dozen more operations like this, spread across 3 territories. Men like Monroe and Harrison, thinking themselves above the law." "Then I guess we both have more work to do," Sarah says. "Me with my badge, you with your prospecting." Jake nods, already thinking about the next hunt, the next corrupt empire to dismantle. "Justice takes time," he quotes the inscription on his watch, "but it always comes due eventually." Outside, the sun is rising over Eagle's Crossing, painting the sky in shades of promise. Just as it did in Serpent's Gap, change is coming to this town. The kind of change Jimmy Hawkins died believing in, the kind Sarah now helps bring about wearing his badge. And somewhere out there, other corrupt men are building their empires, thinking themselves safe from justice's reach. Let them think that. Let them dismiss rumors of an old prospector asking questions, gathering evidence, building cases piece by piece. The hunt goes on. The territory changes. And in the dawn's early light, Mason the hunter rides toward justice once more, that final round, still waiting for the moment when it's truly needed. Some legends never die. They just learn new ways to serve justice. As the federal marshals process Harrison and his men, Jake and Sarah step out onto the boardwalk of Eagle's Crossing. The town is waking up to a new reality, just as Serpent's Gap did a month ago. Already, people are gathering in small groups, whispering about the judge's arrest, about the changes coming to their town. "Found this in Harrison's office." Sarah hands Jake a folder thick with documents, correspondence with Monroe, details of their operations together. But there's something else. Letters mentioning a gathering, some kind of meeting of their entire organization. Jake flips through the papers, his expression thoughtful. 3 weeks from now, in Denver, all the major players are coming together to discuss the future of their operation, probably planning to choose Monroe's replacement. Perfect opportunity, Sarah observes. "Get them all in one place." "Or perfect trap," Jake counters. "They'll be expecting some kind of move against them. We'll have security, contingency plans." A rider approaches, Holbrook, who's been working with both Jake and Sarah since Monroe's fall. "Check the judge's mansion," he reports. "Found something interesting in a hidden safe. List of names, dates, locations. Looks like their entire network." Jake takes the list, scanning it quickly. Some names we knew about, some we didn't. Government officials, business leaders, even a few foreign investors. Whole operation's bigger than we thought. Which means the Denver meeting is even more important, Sarah says. Chance to take down not just the local corruption, but the entire organization. They move to the judge's mansion, now being searched by federal agents. The building is a monument to corrupt wealth, just like Monroe's ranch was. Expensive artwork, imported furniture, all bought with stolen money and broken lives. Interesting thing about this list, Jake muses, still studying the documents. Some of these names, they're not just corrupt officials. They're reformers, people known for fighting against corruption. Sarah's eyes narrow. Double agents playing both sides? Smart strategy, Holbrook observes. Plant your own people in reform movements. Control the opposition from within. Jake nods slowly. Makes our job harder. Can't trust anyone completely, not even those claiming to be on our side. A federal agent approaches with more documents found in the mansion. Among them is a newspaper clipping about Monroe's death, with handwritten notes in the margins. Jake reads them with interest. Harrison was suspicious, he tells Sarah. Though Monroe's fall was too well orchestrated, started looking for patterns. He found connections between various investigations, realized someone was coordinating them. That's why he was meeting secretly at Thunder Canyon, Sarah realizes, trying to set up his own network, separate from the main organization. Man, like that, Holbrook adds, probably had his own insurance, information that could hurt his allies if anything happened to him. Jake moves to the mansion's study, taking in the map of the territory hanging on the wall. It's marked with various notations: property boundaries, proposed railroad routes, locations of mineral deposits. The same kind of map Monroe had, showing how they carved up the territory between them. Denver meeting changes things, he says, finally. Can't just pick them off one by one anymore. Need to take down the whole organization at once. How? Sarah asks. Even with federal backing, we don't have enough manpower to arrest everyone on that list. A slight smile touches Jake's weathered face. Same way we took down Monroe. Patience, planning, using their own paranoia against them. He pulls out his new watch, the one Sarah gave him, studying its inscription again. Justice takes time, he reads aloud, but it also takes trust. Partnership between official law and unofficial methods. What are you thinking? Sarah's voice carries a note of recognition. She's seen this look before, when he was planning Monroe's downfall. Denver's a bigger stage than Serpent's Gap, Jake explains. More players, more pieces in motion, but the principle's the same. Give them something obvious to focus on, while the real operation works in shadow. He turns to Sarah. How'd you like to attend a meeting of corrupt officials? Right out in the open, wearing that marshal's badge? Her eyes widen as she understands. Let them think we're being bold, aggressive. While they're watching the official law enforcement, they won't be watching for an old prospector asking innocent questions in mining camps, Jake finishes. Or for certain Apache warriors who owe me favors. Or for federal agents posing as railroad surveyors. Holbrook grins. Just like with Monroe. Multiple layers of deception all working together, but bigger, Jake continues. This time we're not just taking down one corrupt judge. We're dismantling an entire system of corruption. Going to need help. Every honest lawman, every person who's tired of living under their control. Sarah touches her badge thoughtfully. Jimmy always said the territory was worth fighting for, worth dying for, if necessary. Not this time, Jake says firmly. This time we do it smart, careful. Use everything we learned from Monroe's case. He moves to the window, looking out over Eagle's Crossing. The sun has climbed higher, burning away the last shadows of Harrison's reign. In the street, people are beginning to walk taller, speak more freely, just like they did in Serpent's Gap. 3 weeks, he says softly. 3 weeks to put all the pieces in place, to turn Denver into a trap they'll never see coming. And after Denver, Holbrook asks. What then? Jake's hand drops to his gun, to that final round that's become more a symbol than ammunition. After Denver, we start rebuilding, not just individual towns, but the entire territory, building the kind of justice Jimmy died believing in. Sarah steps up beside him, looking out at their handiwork, another corrupt empire dismantled, another town freed from fear. Together, she says, official and unofficial, badge and shadow, all working for the same goal. Together, Jake agrees. The way it always should have been. The morning wind carries the scent of change, sage and desert flowers mixed with possibility. In 3 weeks, the corrupt heart of the territory will gather in Denver, thinking themselves safe in their power and wealth. Let them gather. Let them plot and scheme, never suspecting that their own meeting is part of a larger plan. Let them dismiss rumors of federal investigations, of a marshal named Hawkins who can't be bought, of an old prospector who appears and disappears like a ghost. The hunt goes on. The territory changes. And in the clear light of morning, Mason, the hunter, begins his greatest hunt, not for revenge or justice alone, but for the future itself. Some legends never die. They just find new ways to serve the truth that men like Jimmy Hawkins died protecting. The truth that Sarah now upholds with her badge, that Jake pursues through shadow and deception. The truth that justice, real justice, is worth any price to achieve. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.